I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved to the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, with its weathered wooden exterior, creaky floors, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow sound. I moved there in the summer, looking for a quiet place to write my novel. Little did I know, I would find something far more sinister. The first few days were uneventful, spent unpacking boxes and setting up my office in the spacious attic. The view from up there was breathtaking, with rolling fields and dense woods stretching out as far as the eye could see. It was perfect, or so I thought. It started with small things. The occasional creak in the floorboards when I knew I was alone. Doors that I swore I'd closed would be open when I returned, and the feeling of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the stories I'd heard about the house's history. The locals avoided the place, calling it haunted and cursed. They spoke in hushed tones about the family that once lived there, a tragedy that had left its mark on the house. I was too rational, too skeptical to believe any of it. Ghost stories were for campfires and children, not adults. One particularly hot summer afternoon, I decided to visit the local library to learn more about the house's history. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, was a sweet old lady who had lived in the town all her life. When I mentioned the farmhouse, her cheerful demeanor changed. She looked around as if to make sure no one was listening before leaning in and whispering, "That house has a dark past. Be careful." Intrigued, I pressed her for more information. She told me about the Henderson family who had lived there in the 1920s. George and Mary Henderson were a young couple with a daughter named Lily. They seemed happy at first, but things took a dark turn. Lily started talking about an imaginary friend, and soon after, strange occurrences began to plague the family. Objects moved on their own, whispers filled the night, and shadows seemed to come alive. Then, one night, Lily disappeared without a trace. George and Mary were found dead in the house a few days later, under mysterious circumstances. One evening, as I was working late into the night, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I almost missed it, but it sent chills down my spine. I paused, listening intently, but the house was silent again. Shaking off the unease, I went back to my writing, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The next day, I decided to explore the house further. I had avoided the basement since moving in, partly because of the darkness and damp smell that emanated from it. Armed with a flashlight, I descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step echoing in the confined space. The basement was filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and the faint smell of mildew. As I explored, my flashlight beam caught something odd. A door at the far end of the room, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes. I pushed the boxes aside and tried the handle. It was locked, but the wood was old and brittle. With a bit of force, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. Inside, I found an old trunk. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, clearly untouched for years. I opened it to find old photographs, letters, and a diary. The photos were black and white, depicting a happy family. A man, a woman, and their young daughter. As I flipped through the diary, I felt a cold draft, and the whispering started again, louder this time. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I took the diary and photographs upstairs, planning to study them more closely. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt oppressive, as if it was alive and watching me. The whispers became more frequent, and I began to see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. The diary belonged to Mary Henderson. She wrote about their life in the farmhouse, filled with joy at first, but then her entries grew darker. She described Lily's imaginary friend, whom she called Mr. Shadow. At first it seemed innocent enough, but soon Lily became withdrawn and fearful. Mary wrote about hearing whispers at night, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. The final entries were frantic, talking about shadows in the night, voices, and the feeling of impending doom. Disturbed, I started researching the house's history in more depth. I visited the town's archives, hoping to find more information. The archivist, Mr. Coleman, was hesitant to speak about the farmhouse. "Some things are better left buried," he said, but eventually he relented and showed me old newspaper clippings and police reports. The more I learned, the more the supernatural occurrences intensified. Objects would move on their own, the whispers grew louder, and I began to see a figure at the edge of my vision. A little girl in a white dress. I tried to convince myself it was stress and lack of sleep, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. One night, I woke up to find Lily standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and hollow. She whispered my name, her voice echoing in the silent room. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. She pointed towards the basement and then vanished. I knew I had to go back down there to face whatever was haunting the house. Armed with a flashlight and the diary, I descended the stairs once more. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. As I approached the hidden room, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Inside the room, I found a hidden passage behind the trunk. It led to a small, hidden chamber with strange symbols painted on the walls and a crude altar in the center. On the altar was a lock of Lily's hair and a photograph of her, surrounded by candles that flickered despite the lack of wind. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and I was plunged into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. In a panic, I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, illuminating the ghostly figure of Mary. She looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and rage, and then she spoke. "She wants to come back," Mary whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "You have to stop her." Before I could ask what she meant, she vanished, and the room grew colder. The shadows around me began to move, coalescing into the form of Lily. Her eyes were filled with a malevolent gleam, and she smiled at me, a twisted, sinister smile. I realized then that Lily was not the innocent child she appeared to be. She was something else, something evil that had taken over the house. Mary and her husband had tried to stop her, but they had failed. With a surge of determination, I grabbed the photograph and the lock of hair from the altar. I knew I had to destroy them, to break whatever hold Lily had on the house. As I set them on fire, Lily screamed, a sound that echoed through the house and into my very soul. The flames consumed the photograph and the hair, and as they did, Lily's form began to waver and fade. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I felt a sense of peace return to the house for the first time since I moved in. In the aftermath, I moved out of the farmhouse, unable to shake the memories of what had happened there. The house still stands, a silent sentinel to the horrors it once contained. I sometimes wonder if anyone else will be drawn to it, if they will hear the whispers and see the shadows. I never finished my novel, but I did write down my experiences. Maybe someday, someone will read my story and understand the terror that lurks in the old farmhouse. Until then, I can only hope that the house remains empty, its secrets buried in the past where they belong. Years passed, and I tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that summer haunted me. I found myself drawn to other stories of haunted houses, hoping to find answers, to make sense of what I had experienced. I corresponded with paranormal investigators, read countless books on the subject, and even visited other supposedly haunted locations, but nothing compared to the farmhouse. One day, I received a letter from a young couple who had recently moved into the farmhouse. They found my contact information in the town's archives and wanted to know more about the house's history. My heart sank as I read their letter, filled with the same initial excitement and curiosity I had felt. I decided to visit them, to warn them about what they were dealing with. As I drove up the familiar dirt road, the sight of the farmhouse brought back a flood of memories. The young couple, Sarah and Mark, greeted me warmly, eager to show me around. They had done a lot of work to the place, making it look more like a home. But as we walked through the house, I could sense it, the same oppressive feeling. The whispers just beyond hearing. I told them everything, from the history of the Henderson family to my own experiences. They listened intently, their faces growing pale. Sarah confessed that she had started hearing whispers at night and seeing shadows move out of the corner of her eye. Mark had been more skeptical, but even he couldn't deny the strange occurrences. We decided to perform a cleansing ritual, hoping to rid the house of its malevolent presence once and for all. We gathered supplies, sage, salt, candles, and holy water, and set to work. As we moved through the house, chanting and burning sage, the atmosphere grew heavier. The whispers turned into screams, and shadows danced on the walls. In the basement, we found the hidden room once more. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. As we sprinkled holy water and salt, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing our candles. In the darkness, we heard Lily's voice, filled with anger and desperation. "Why won't you let me come back?" she screamed. We stood our ground, continuing the ritual, despite the fear gripping our hearts. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. I could feel Lily's presence, a force of pure malevolence. But we pressed on, our voices growing stronger as we chanted the final words of the cleansing ritual. There was a blinding flash of light, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The whispers stopped, and the shadows receded. For the first time, the house felt truly empty, free of the malevolent presence that had haunted it for so long. Exhausted but relieved, we left the basement and gathered in the living room. Sarah and Mark were shaken but grateful. They decided to move out, unwilling to risk their safety despite the successful cleansing. I couldn't blame them. Some places are just too haunted to ever be truly safe. As I drove away from the farmhouse for the last time, I felt a sense of closure. The house's secrets were finally laid to rest, and the spirits of the Henderson family could find peace. I hoped that no one else would be drawn to the house, that it would remain empty and forgotten. In the years that followed, I continued to write about my experiences, sharing my story with anyone who would listen. I hoped that by doing so, I could help others understand the dangers of messing with the unknown, to respect the boundaries between our world and the next. The farmhouse still stands, a silent sentinel to the horrors it once contained. I drive by it occasionally, and each time I feel a chill run down my spine. The memories of that summer will always haunt me, but I find solace in knowing that I faced the darkness and survived. If you ever find yourself drawn to an old abandoned house with a dark history, remember my story. Some places are better left alone, their secrets buried in the past. Listen to the whispers, heed the warnings, and never, ever underestimate the power of the unknown. And so, I leave you with this. Be careful where you tread, for the past never truly stays buried, and the shadows of history have a way of reaching out, eager to claim new victims. The old farmhouse on the outskirts of town stands as a testament to that truth, a reminder that some places are best left to the ghosts who haunt them,